The diner was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet where you could hear the soft clinking of plates and the low hum of the old ceiling fan above. A few people sat in booths, eating slowly, talking softly. Outside, the sun was hot and bright. But inside, the air felt heavy, almost still, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. She walked in slowly, a young woman with a slight limp, moving carefully as if she didn't want anyone to notice her. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she wore a simple blue dress that had clearly been washed many times. Her shoes were worn out at the edges. She carried a small purse, clutched tightly as though she was scared someone might take. She chose a seat near the corner, close to the window but away from the crowd. It was her favorite spot whenever she came here, because she could see the road outside and pretend she was somewhere else. Maybe somewhere people didn't stare so much. She kept her eyes on the table, trying not to look at anyone. She had learned long ago that looking people in the eye sometimes made them stare longer. She ordered a small meal, just enough to fill her stomach for the day. Because she didn't have much money. At first, no one paid her much attention. But then, from a booth across the room, a group of men started whispering. They looked at her, then at each other, and one of them chuckled. It started small, just a few words said too loudly. Something about the way she walked. Something about her being alone again. She didn't look up, didn't say anything, just kept her eyes on the menu even though she had already ordered. But the men didn't stop. They never did. Soon the words became clearer, crueler. They laughed as they talked, like it was a joke everyone should find funny. A couple sitting near the door looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. The waitress frowned as she walked past, but she didn't step in either. The young woman felt her hands shaking as she held her fork. Her meal had arrived, but she couldn't eat. It felt like the whole room was staring at her now. Her ears burned. She wished she could stand up and leave, but she couldn't make her legs move. It was like being frozen in place, like the words had pinned her there. She had been through this before. People staring, people laughing, people thinking she didn't hear the things they said under their breath. Sometimes she wanted to scream at them, tell them she wasn't made of stone, tell them words cut deeper than they knew. But she never did. It was easier to stay quiet, to let them think she didn't care. But today, something about it hurt more. Maybe it was because the diner was so quiet, and every word they said felt louder than usual. Maybe it was because she was tired of feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. One of the men imitated her walk, his voice carrying across the diner. His friends laughed so hard one of them slapped the table. She lowered her head even more, staring at the scratches on the old wooden table in front of her. If she didn't look up, maybe it would all stop. Maybe they would get bored, but it didn't stop. The laughter grew, and now even people who weren't part of it were watching. Some looked away quickly, pretending they didn't hear anything. Others just stared like it was some kind of show. Her throat felt tight. She tried to eat a bite of her food, but it felt like sand in her mouth. Her eyes burned, but she blinked fast, refusing to cry here. Not in front of them. And then the door opened. It was just a sound at first, the small bell above the door ringing as it always did. But for some reason, the room seemed to change. The laughter didn't stop right away, but it softened like people had noticed something was different. She looked up just enough to see him. A man had walked in, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black leather jacket with a patch on the back, a skull with wings. Letters she had seen before, but never this close. A Hell's Angel. He didn't look at anyone at first. Just walked to the counter, boots heavy on the floor, and sat down. The waitress hurried over, looking nervous, but he only ordered coffee in a low, even voice. The group of men went quiet for a moment. Then one of them laughed again, but softer now, like even they weren't sure what to do. The young woman didn't move. She didn't know this man. She didn't know anything about him, but something about the way he carried himself made her heart beat faster. Not in fear, but in a way that made her think. Maybe today wouldn't end the way she thought it would. The man at the counter didn't seem in a hurry. He sat there quietly, his back straight, his leather jacket carrying the weight of many years and many roads. His face was partly hidden under the shadow of his cap, but anyone who looked at him knew he wasn't someone to mess with. He wrapped his big hands around the coffee mug the waitress brought him and just sat there, drinking slowly, saying nothing. The room felt different now, like a storm had rolled in without warning. People spoke in low voices, forks scraping against plates, sounding louder than they should have. The group of men who had been laughing so loudly before suddenly seemed unsure of themselves. They looked at the stranger, then at each other. One of them tried to keep the jokes going, forcing out a laugh that didn't sound so confident anymore. The others chuckled weakly, but it wasn't the same as before. The young woman in the corner didn't move. She sat still, her head bent, but her eyes lifted just enough to watch him. Something about his presence made her feel safe. She couldn't explain it. He hadn't even looked at her yet, hadn't said a word to anyone in the room, but it felt like he saw everything, heard everything, and was just waiting. The man at the counter finished his coffee slowly, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like someone planning to fight. But there was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that made people uneasy. Finally, he set the mug down. The sound of ceramic touching wood was small, but somehow it made everyone stop talking. Even the men who had been laughing fell silent. He turned on his stool slowly, like he had been thinking about this for a while. His eyes swept the room once, calm but sharp, before landing on the group in the corner. Nobody moved. He didn't speak. Right away, he just stared at them, his face unreadable, his eyes steady like he could see right through them. One of the men shifted in his seat, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. Another tried to smile, but it came out wrong, nervous, like he wanted to pretend nothing had happened. Finally, the man in the leather jacket spoke. Something funny? His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the room like thunder. One of the men cleared his throat. Just talking, he muttered. The stranger tilted his head slightly. Talking, he repeated slowly, his tone flat. Sounded more like laughing at someone who didn't deserve it. The man who had been imitating the girl earlier shifted in his seat again. We didn't mean anything by it, he said quickly. Trying to sound casual. The stranger just kept staring. The diner was so quiet, now you could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Even the waitress had stopped moving, holding the coffee pot frozen in her hands. The young woman in the corner felt her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, didn't know why this man was stepping in, but she couldn't look away. The stranger finally pushed himself off the stool and walked toward the table slowly, his boots heavy on the floor. He stopped right in front of the men, his shadow falling over them. One of them tried to smile again. Look, man, it was just a joke. The stranger leaned forward slightly, his voice low but sharp enough to cut the air. A joke? He said. You think it's funny to tear someone down who's just trying to eat in peace? No one answered. He looked at each of them, one by one, his eyes cold but calm. How about you try picking on someone who can fight back, he said softly. Or maybe you only feel tough when the person can't. The words hit harder than if he had shouted. The men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them muttered, We didn't mean nothing, it's no big deal. The stranger didn't move. It is a big deal, he said quietly. You should be ashamed. And then he stepped back, like he had said everything he needed to say. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just stood there, calm and steady, and somehow that was scarier than anything else. The young woman stared at him, her hands still trembling slightly, but now for a different reason. No one had ever spoken up for her like that. Not once. The first time since she had walked in, the diner was completely silent. The silence in the diner was so thick that even the sound of the ceiling fan above felt loud. The stranger stood there, his presence filling the entire room like a wall nobody wanted to push against. The men who had been laughing moments ago sat frozen in their seats. No one reached for their drinks. No one spoke. The young woman in the corner sat very still, eyes fixed on the man in the leather jacket. She didn't know his name. She didn't know why he cared. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. The man leaned one hand on the table in front of the group. He didn't slam it down or make a scene. He didn't have to. His calmness was heavier than anger could ever. "B, you think you look strong?" he said, his voice steady, almost quiet. "Mocking someone who's done nothing to you?" The man who had imitated the girl earlier shifted in his seat. His smirk was gone now. He glanced at his friends, but none of them looked back. "We were just joking," one of them said weakly. The stranger didn't blink. "A joke," he repeated. His eyes moved slowly from one face to the next. "Tell me, did she laugh?" "Number." One answered. "Did anyone here laugh?" He asked again, his tone still calm but sharper now, like the edge of a knife. The men stared down at the table. Their confidence had drained out of them like water leaking from a cracked bucket. The stranger straightened up slowly. He wasn't a young man, but he carried himself like someone who had seen enough of life to know when to stand his ground. He looked at them again, his expression unreadable. "I've seen real strength," he said, his voice low but steady. "It's not in tearing people down, it's in lifting them up. You want to act tough? Try protecting someone who needs it instead of hurting them." The leader of the group shifted again, trying to find his voice. "Look, we said we didn't mean it like that," he muttered. The stranger leaned slightly closer, his eyes locking. "On him, you meant it exactly like that," he said softly. The words hit harder than if he had shouted. The man's face reddened, and he looked away, his mouth opening but no words coming out. The entire diner was watching now. The couple near. The door had stopped eating. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter, coffee pot still in her hand. Even the cook had leaned on the pass-through window, arms folded, eyes on the scene unfolding. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the stranger turned slightly, his eyes landing on the young woman in the corner. She froze, unsure what he was. "Going to say, you okay?" he asked, his tone softer now. She nodded quickly, though her throat felt tight. She wasn't used to people asking her that. The stranger looked back at the group. "Apologize," he said simply. The man who had mocked her shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, sure." "Sorry," he muttered. The stranger tilted his head. "Try again," he said quietly. The man swallowed hard. He looked at the young woman, then back at the stranger. "I'm sorry," he said, louder this time, his voice rough, like the words didn't come easy. The stranger watched him for a moment, then nodded once. "Better," he said. He stepped back from the table, his eyes sweeping over the group one last time. None of them could meet his gaze. "You see," he said calmly, almost like he was teaching a lesson. "It costs nothing to be decent. Nothing. But it tells the world the kind of man you are." The words hung in the air long after he finished speaking. The stranger turned then, walking slowly back toward the counter. His boots echoed on the floor, each step heavy and certain. The men didn't move. Nobody did. The young woman felt her heartbeat slowly settle as she watched him sit back down. The room was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This one felt different, like the air was lighter now. The stranger picked up his coffee mug again, as calm as if nothing had happened. But everyone in the diner knew something had changed. The men kept their heads down, the laughter gone from their faces. The young woman sat a little straighter in her seat, still unsure how to feel, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like disappearing. And the stranger? He just sipped his coffee, eyes on the window like none of it had been about him at all. Asterisk. The diner stayed quiet long after the stranger had spoken. The group of men sat stiffly in their booth, eyes down, as if hoping the floor might open and swallow them whole. No one laughed now. No one even whispered. The weight of their earlier cruelty hung over them like a heavy storm cloud. The young woman still hadn't moved much. Her fork rested on her plate, untouched. Her hands trembled a little less than before, but her heart still beat too fast. She didn't quite know what to do, whether to thank the man, whether to leave, or whether to just stay silent and pretend this was all some strange dream. The stranger, however, looked like none of this had shaken him at all. He finished his coffee slowly, his face calm, his movements unhurried, like he had dealt with far worse in his life. Then he turned slightly toward the waitress, who had been standing frozen behind the counter the entire time. "Bring her something." "Sweet," he said simply, nodding toward the young woman. The waitress blinked, startled. "Sir?" "Pie," he said. "Chocolate if you got it." The waitress nodded quickly and hurried to the kitchen, almost relieved to have something to do. The stranger leaned back in his seat, arms crossed loosely, as though the entire diner wasn't staring at him like he was someone out of a movie. Young woman lowered her eyes again. She didn't want to meet anyone's gaze. She hated attention, especially after everything that had just happened. But when the waitress returned with a slice of chocolate pie and set it gently in front of her, she didn't refuse. The stranger spoke then, his voice softer this time, directed at the group of men who had caused all the trouble. "Pay for her." "Meal," he said simply. One of the men opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, then thought better of it. They all shifted, fumbling for their wallets. Bills landed on the table quickly, none of them daring to complain about the amount. The stranger watched silently until it was done. Then he nodded once, like a judge closing a case. The men stood awkwardly, muttered something about leaving, and walked out. No one looked at the young woman. No one looked at the stranger. The bell over the door rang behind them, and then they were gone. The diner seemed to breathe again. People went back to their meals slowly, conversations starting up in low voices, the way people talk after witnessing something they know they'll remember for a long time. The stranger finally looked at the young woman. "You eat," he said, gently, nodding toward the pie. She hesitated. I don't want to be a problem," she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of the ceiling fan. "You're not," he said simply. She picked up her fork slowly. Her hands still shook. A little, but she took a small bite. The sweetness hit her tongue, soft and rich, and for some reason, it made her eyes sting with tears she didn't want anyone to see. The stranger didn't say anything else for a moment. He just sat there, letting her eat in peace, like this was the most normal thing in the world. Finally he spoke again, his tone calm but carrying weight. "You don't let people like that tell you who you are," he said. "Their words say more about them than they ever will about you." She nodded slightly, unsure what to say. No one had ever stood up for her like this before. People usually looked away, pretended not to hear, or whispered about how awful it was but never stepped in. He sipped the last of his coffee. "World's full of cowards," he added. "But it's full of decent folks, too. Don't let the first kind make you forget the second exists." The young woman swallowed hard, keeping her eyes on her plate. She didn't trust her voice enough to answer. The stranger stood then, pulling a few bills from his jacket and setting them on the counter, enough to pay for both their meals, and leave a tip so big the waitress blinked in surprise. He adjusted his jacket, the leather creaking softly. "You take care of yourself," he said to the young woman, his voice low but steady. She nodded again, finally looking up at him. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a small nod like it was nothing at all, and turned toward the door. The sound of his boots faded as he walked out. A moment later, the roar of a motorcycle engine filled the air outside, then grew distant as he rode away. The diner slowly returned to normal, but for the young woman sitting in the corner with her half-eaten pie, nothing felt the same. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. The diner door closed behind him, and the rumble of his motorcycle slowly faded until there was nothing left but the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the faint clinking of silverware. People went back to their meals, but the room didn't feel the same anymore. Something about what had just happened lingered in the air, like the smell after rain, clean, sharp, impossible to ignore. The young woman sat there for a long time, staring at the slice of pie he had ordered for her. The first few bites had been hard to swallow because her throat felt tight, but now the sweetness settled on her tongue, warming her in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the sugar. It was the kindness behind it that she hadn't tasted. Kindness in a long time. The waitress came over quietly, setting a fresh glass of water on the table. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked softly. The young woman nodded. "Yes, I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered a little. The waitress looked toward the door where the stranger had left. "Not every day you see someone like him. Walk in here," she murmured. "But I'll tell you what. I've never seen those men pay for anyone's meal before. Guess he changed that today." The young woman didn't know what to say, so she just nodded again, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth for the first time that day. Outside the window, the sky was turning gold with late afternoon light. Cars passed by. People went on with their lives, but inside, she sat still, replaying the moment in her mind, the heavy boots, the calm voice, the way he had spoken like it was the simplest thing in the world to stand up for someone else. No one had ever done that for her before, for years. She had learned to keep her head down, to take the stares and whispers and laughter like bruises she couldn't hide. People thought words didn't hurt because they didn't leave marks you could see, but she felt them. Every day. And then out of nowhere, a stranger in a leather jacket had walked in and changed the story. She finished the last bite of pie slowly, almost wishing it wouldn't end. Then she reached into her small purse to pay for her meal, only to realize the man had already covered it. The waitress smiled softly when she saw her confusion. "He paid for everything," she said. "Said you shouldn't have to." The young woman's chest tightened. "Why?" she whispered, half to herself. The waitress shrugged. "Maybe because he knows what it's like," she said. The young woman didn't know what to say. She wanted to find him, to thank him properly, but he was already gone. The sound of his motorcycle was only a memory now. She sat there for a long moment, then slowly stood up. As she walked to the door, she felt different. Her shoulders weren't hunched the way they had been when she came in. Her steps didn't feel as heavy. She pushed the door open and stepped into the evening light. The air smelled of summer dust and gasoline from where his motorcycle had been. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. But she would never forget the way he had stood there, calm and steady, like a shield she didn't know she needed. People had laughed at her. People had looked away when she needed someone the most, but one man hadn't, and that was enough to remind her that not everyone in the world was cruel. Sometimes, a single moment, a stranger's voice, a slice of pie, a motorcycle disappearing down the road, could put back a piece of you that the world had taken. She walked home with the faintest smile on her lips. The day had started with humiliation. It ended with hope. All because a man in a leather jacket decided enough was enough.